We've looked at civil liberties, and now we're going to look at civil rights. Chapter 5 deals with civil rights. How is that different from civil liberties? Civil liberties were those basic protections that people in the United States enjoy to protect them from government. Civil rights are kind of the opposite. They are the responsibilities that government has to making life and liberty, the pursuit of happiness, a reality for all Americans. In other words, civil rights are the things that government is supposed to do actively to make life better. Traditionally, we think of civil rights as those rights rooted in the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. While the term civil rights goes back in history, early attempts at true protection were unsuccessful because the Supreme Court believed that it was not within its purview to stop non-governmental discrimination. For example, in Plessy v. Ferguson, the Supreme Court held that the separate but equal treatment of people of different races by state governments was not a violation of the 14th Amendment. The Supreme Court eventually overturned Plessy in 1954 in the case of Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka. Since the 1950s, the Supreme Court has held a view that enables the government to offer broader protections to citizens' equality in social and economic life. The modern black civil rights movement is kind of the cornerstone of the discussion, but the right of people to live happily goes beyond African Americans. The second discussion in this chapter deals with women. Women are more than half of the population of the United States, and yet for a long time women were not allowed to vote. Women did not have the same property rights as men, and there was a great deal of discrimination against women. And so, in the second piece of material, we talk about women's struggle for civil rights, the gender issue. And then more subtle discrimination, both in terms of blacks as well as women, indirect discrimination, and how we have struggled as a country to pass laws and enforce laws to basically protect individuals against either formal or informal discrimination. If you look at the population of the United States, you will obviously see that older Americans, people with disabilities, gays and lesbians, people such as young people, underage, all fall into categories of groups of Americans that have the right to be treated equally, the right to be treated with respect, and to be full citizens, but have often been denied that for either legal or just cultural reasons. So this chapter deals with what government has to do to make life good for all Americans. And it is a very important chapter because at one point or another, all of us may fall into one of those categories that needs to be served by our country. Now let's summarize the points from this chapter. Before the Civil War, most African Americans were slaves, and slavery was protected by the Constitution. Constitutional amendments after the Civil War ended slavery, and African Americans gained citizenship, the right to vote, and other rights. However, African American inequality continued, and in 1896 the Supreme Court ruled in Plessy v. Ferguson that separation of race is not a violation of the Constitution. Some of the ineffectiveness of the civil rights laws, we see Plessy versus Ferguson again. There were voting barriers to try to keep the African Americans and poor whites from voting. You'll see one, poll taxes. You'll likely see that on your quiz. A way to dissuade African Americans and poor whites from voting. Segregation was finally declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka in 1954, in which the court stated that separation implied inferiority. Some of the reactions after Brown versus Board of Education included different forms of segregation that continued. One of those forms that you should know is de facto segregation. That's segregation because of racial patterns, and concentration of populations, not laws. You see that in many cities, including Fresno, where there's a certain type of segregation just based on where people of different races and ethnicities live. In 1955, the modern civil rights movement began with a boycott of segregated public transportation in Montgomery, Alabama. Civil rights movement also moved forward with Dr. Martin Luther King Dr. King's civil rights movement was based on the philosophy of nonviolence, civil disobedience. We saw nonviolent demonstrations in the March on Washington. Number of modern civil rights legislation. Voting Rights Act of 1965 outlawed discriminatory voter registration tests and authorized federal voter registration. Voting Rights Act and other protective legislation apply not only to African Americans, but to other ethnic groups. Civil rights are protected by the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, and in particular by the Due Process and Equal Protection Clauses. The courts have developed a series of tests to use when considering cases of possible discrimination. First is strict scrutiny. That assesses the constitutionality of a law or government action when it threatens to interfere with a fundamental right or potential discrimination against members of a class, such as, race, religion, national origin. Intermediate scrutiny is employed in cases involving women's rights, and rational basis review is used when strict or exacting scrutiny does not apply. That's the easiest test to meet. Affirmative action programs have been controversial because they may lead to reverse discrimination against majority groups or even minority groups. One of the most important cases, one that you should know, is the Bakke case. The courts ruled in the Bakke case, race cannot be the sole factor in admissions decisions. A couple of definitions related to affirmative action that you should know. First, what is affirmative action? That's a policy in admissions or hiring that gives special consideration to traditionally disadvantaged groups to overcome present effects of past discrimination. And as we just mentioned, reverse discrimination, that's the charge that some affirmative action programs actually discriminate against non-minorities. In the early history of the United States, women had no political rights. After the first Women's Rights Convention in 1848, the women's movement gained momentum. Not until 1920, however, when the 19th Amendment was ratified, did women obtain the right to vote nationwide. The modern women's movement began in the 1960s in the wake of civil rights and anti-Vietnam War movement. Efforts to secure the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment failed, but the women's movement has been successful in obtaining new laws, changes in social customs, and increased political representation. Number of women in Congress, other federal government bodies has increased significantly in the 1990s and 2000 and 2010. Federal government efforts to eliminate gender discrimination in the workplace include Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits gender-based discrimination, including sexual harassment on the job. Wage discrimination continues to be a problem for women, and the definition you should know: gender discrimination, any practice, policy, or procedure that denies equality of treatment to an individual or group because of gender. Finally, we'll talk about rights and status of juveniles. Children have few rights and protections, in part because it is presumed that their parents protect them. 26th Amendment grants the right to vote to those ages 18 or older. Even after the 26th Amendment, though, we haven't seen the voting population of young people increase at the rate that people would like to see it go. Minors have some defense against criminal prosecution because of their presumed inability to have criminal intent below certain ages. For those under the age of criminal responsibility, there are state juvenile courts. When minors are tried as adults, they are entitled to the procedural protections afforded to adults and are usually subject to adult penalties. Please use this lecture as well as your study guide to prepare for this week's quiz. Good luck.